I think he speaking by English so you can understand it.
Okay, so I am going to see if I can hear. Let's see if this is going to come up. If this is going to work. Come on. Come on, play.
Are those the things you're gonna go over today?
Yeah, I'm gonna, if I can get my thing to work so that I can try and make sure that the sound is on. The sound is on. Oh, yeah, it's on. It's working. The sound is on. That's great. So I don't have to stop it and try to go over it again. So where we're going to head today is I'm going to finish talking about consumer behavior. We're going to talk about the communication process and then source, factors, channel, and choosing channel factors and overview. And then I will have, hopefully by that point in time, I'll get through that and I can put the first exam on D2L. It will open today and you'll have 1 week to complete it. So we're still a little bit behind where we said we'd be in the schedule, but this is a good place to do a module 1 exam. And then I'll push the other stuff into the second module and hopefully I can get caught up. Next time I'll also try and talk about the IMC projects that will be due at the end of the semester, give you some more details on that. So we're going to finish talking about consumer behavior today, then go into source, channel, and other factors and discuss that. Oh, and the communication process. So we were talking about consumer behavior and the idea of the rational actor model. And we talked about low-level rationality versus higher-order rationality, which is the idea that you can engage in irrational decisions, but you can pursue those irrational decisions from a rational perspective. And of course, the most extreme historic example of that is Nazi Germany, where it's a completely irrational decision to decide that you're going to exterminate a huge percentage of your population. But if you're going to do that, they went about it in a very rational manner. So when we talk about these things, when we talk about consumer behavior, we have to recognize that a lot of consumer behavior decisions are not necessarily rational. And scholars, marketing ethicists like myself, look at whether or not, as marketers, we're creating irrational wants and desires in the consuming public, and something that we have to think about. So, but if you're going to do that, the model says basically people pursue goals, they plan to achieve those goals. It begins with problem recognition, then you search for information, internal searches and external searches. If it's not something that you've ever purchased before, you may engage in more analysis of alternatives than something that you purchased a lot. For example, going out to lunch is something that you purchase, almost every day, considering that everybody eats out almost 3 meals. Studies show that very few people are eating at home now. So you know what the fast food selections are, the casual dining, or if you want something more, exotic than that, what the sort of choices are, and so you don't have to do a lot of external searching. Then you evaluate alternatives, then you make a decision, and then you evaluate whether or not the decision turned out well. Now, in opposition to the rational actor model, is what we might call the irrational actor model. And I know I'm skipping through some stuff like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I sort of touched on that, I think, last time. It's on the PowerPoint for those of you who want. And there's also previous videos from other semesters when I've taught this course, if you want to look at that. There's another model that says people just sort of react to stimuli in very predictable ways, but not necessarily going through this problem recognition, search, and evaluation, and then purchase, and then post-purchase evaluation. That most of the time what we do is we just sort of react to things, that people are not rational. They respond to stimuli. We're just sort of like tumbleweeds blowing in the desert out there, and whichever way the wind blows us, that's what we go with. So a guy named Martin Lindstrom in a book called Biology talks about this. I think I've talked about this book before. It's not VIO, it's VUYOLOGY. And it's the science of why we buy the things we do. And he looks at brain patterns. So people tell us, for example, that they don't like something, and yet they will consume it. One of the classics involved in this is one of the things that I absolutely hate to watch, but it seems to be a fairly popular show. Hoarders, or the Intervention reality TV series. Have any of you seen any of these? No.
Hoarders.
You've seen Hoarders? So Hoarders involves like people who live in these horrible conditions. They've collected or accumulated all kinds of junk, and they just can't seem to get rid of it for whatever reason. They're obsessed with it, and it leads to bad health effects. Their houses are filthy. That leads to upper respiratory problems because there's all this dust and things like that in the houses. And they go in and they clean them up. And I think one of the reasons that, and people, when they do studies on this, when they have done sort of research studies, people have said, "Oh God, no, I would never watch that," and yet we do. And I think the one reason that we respond to that is we say, well, we don't want to watch human beings suffer and be miserable. But I think the reason that those shows are popular is because they allow us to say things like, at least I'm not that bad. At least it makes us feel a little bit better about ourselves. And so Lindstrom looks at this and he says, look, people, they don't really act in rational ways. They say they don't like things, and yet they'll consume them. And consumer surveys, when they ask about, releasing new television shows, they'll ask consumers to watch, as a focus group or something like that. And everybody says, oh my God, that's horrible. I would never watch it. And then the next thing you know, they're watching it. He says, this is an example of irrationality. I don't know if I agree with that. I think one of the things that we can say about that is that people, because of social desirability bias, may not watch or may not say that they're going to watch something, and then they do, and there may be a rational reason for that. And again, the rational reason may be so that we at least maintain our own functional fictions in the world. This is a term that I heard from a psychiatrist one time, functional fictions. Those are the things that we tell ourselves that help us get through the day. And I think for a lot of people, watching shows like Intervention or Hoarders allows them to feel better about themselves. One of my functional fictions is that I come down here, I stand up here for 75 minutes, and I lecture to you all. And at the end of the day, I have transformed you. You've learned something, and I've produced, educated students. And isn't that great? When the reality probably is that 90% of what I say you're not going to remember. The 10% of what I say you'll probably remember incorrectly. And, I don't know how much I'm transforming your lives, but hope springs eternal. So there's a synthesis model. So if we look at things in terms of a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis. So you have a thesis, which the thesis is rational actor model. The antithesis is the irrational actor model. So I'll put rational actor here, irrational actor. And then you have a synthesis. This is the dialectic, which is sort of a combination of the two. It's a moderation model that says if there's high risk involved in things like purchasing housing, automobiles, major appliances, we're more likely to engage in the rational actor model. When we buy a house, that's a huge financial decision. It's the biggest financial decision that most people will make. They're going to be more rational. They're going to look at things like, what's my budget? Because, what can I actually afford? What are the schools like? Do I have kids? Things like that. If it's low risk, something like toothpaste, shampoo, what do we have a tendency to do with that? Well, maybe it's less rational. Most of us, how do we choose? The toothpaste that we choose? It's what we grew up with.
Yeah, or like the thing you've seen advertised the most.
Right. It's just, for most of us, forever and ever and ever. My family, I think it was Crest is what we grew up with. I'm trying to think now back all those years. I've switched because there's only one brand of toothpaste that they sell at Sam's, and so That's what I buy is the, sort of one brand they have at Sam's because it's cheaper and it comes in bulk. But with regard to these higher and more risky purchases, things like, again, housing, we're going to behave in a more rational manner. Whereas with toothpaste and things like that, it may just be what our parents used, the shampoo that we grew up with, things like that, toothpaste that we grew up with. The one thing I would say about that is that it appears that people do act more rationally when they're buying houses, but I can give you an example of at least one where perhaps the model doesn't explain this, or this mixed model doesn't explain it. My mother forever and ever owned a real estate company in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She was the second largest real estate company, and she also was a land developer, so she had a construction company as well. One of the houses that she was selling, and this was back in the mid 1980s, was $1 million home, and the family had just decided it was up in sort of the foothills of Santa Fe in a very desirable area. And they had decided that they were not going to change out the carpet. My mother had gone through, she was sort of one of the early firms to do this thing where they do staging of houses. They go through and tell people things like, you got to get everything out of your closets that's not necessary. So if, for example, it's summertime, get all the winter coats out and take them to storage so that the closets look bigger. Take your family photos down off the mantle so it doesn't look so cluttered, things like that. And she went through and she told the people, you got to switch out this carpet. It's awful. And they said, no, we're just going to give a carpeting allowance for that. And at the time they were giving something like, because this was a really huge home, like a $10,000 carpet allowance, which was a lot of money. And people would come in when they did open houses and they'd say, the house that we looked at, 2 streets over already had new carpet. At that time, beige was the carpet choice that everybody chose. They just put beige carpeting in every like spec house or something like that. Now it's all gray. That's the newest thing, is just to have gray carpet or gray walls. And finally, they'd say, well, it's got new carpet. And we would say things like, but the owners are giving you, wouldn't you rather select your own carpet rather than just, and they're like, the other house has new carpet. A rational actor would say, yeah, I'll take the $10,000 and I'll get the carpet that I want rather than the carpet that's already there. But a lot of people just can't visualize that. And so they went with the carpet that was, just newer, that they weren't going to have to do anything or think about. And that's not an example of people acting rationally, right? It's in your own best interest to choose your carpet, your colors based on what you want. So what are the influences on consumer behavior? There's sociocultural influences. So there are things that we purchase just because it's part of our society. It's what we do. There are lots of things that they don't, for example, eat in other countries, or that are not nearly as popular as they are in this country. And it's just a sociocultural. We even see these kinds of differences in different regions. So my brother, when he went to work for Goldman Sachs, they put him in their Saratoga Springs office for the family office. Saratoga Springs is enormously wealthy, upstate New York kind of resort community. It was a beautiful place. They have the oldest racetrack in America at Saratoga Springs. So one of the biggest races, the Triple Crown, is the Derby, the Belmont, and the Preakness. But actually the oldest race, stakes race in the nation is called the Travers, and it's raced at Saratoga Springs. So he lives in this enormously sort of wealthy community. And one of the things that you could do during racing season, which is in August, the track is only open for 1 month a year and it's in August, is you can go out to the track and watch the morning heats. You can watch them work the horses out before the races of the day. And they have a really wonderful sort of breakfast buffet. And coming from the South, what's one of the things that we eat a lot of at breakfast here in places like Oklahoma?
Bacon, eggs.
Well, they have bacon and
Gravy.
eggs. Biscuits and gravy. There you go. That'll get you a duck. That's the answer I was looking for. Biscuits and gravy. We'd gone to multiple breakfast places, and I am not a big breakfast person. I don't like breakfast. I don't like the food. But if I am going to eat breakfast, the one thing that I really do like, because I was largely raised in the South is biscuits and gravy. It's one of my favorite things to eat. I mean, I don't really like eggs. I do like bacon, but I'm just not a huge breakfast person. I'm not usually hungry in the morning. And so I just generally don't eat breakfast. But if I'm gonna eat it, I want biscuits and gravy. And we'd gone looking my brother's a big breakfast person. We'd gone to all of these little restaurants in Saratoga Springs. Nobody served biscuits and gravy. And in fact, when I asked for biscuits and gravy, people would look at me like I had grown, like they had no idea what this was. And finally, so I noticed at the track, they had biscuits and gravy. I was like, oh my God, this is gonna be so incredible. This is gonna be wonderful. And we went to the track and everything was great about the breakfast except the biscuits and gravy because it's just not part of the culture of that area. The gravy that they had made was turkey gravy to go with the biscuits. It was disgusting, right? Turkey, I mean, like, first of all, anybody who calls turkey, like turkey bacon, they should be shot. I mean, that's just not, I mean, if you want to call it a processed meat product, that's one thing. It's not bacon. And turkey gravy on biscuits is just, it's just like beyond, just doesn't go. So
when I went to England, everybody had like beans on toast and stuff for breakfast.
they have a lot of different stuff. They have biscuits and gravy in England, by the way, but it's totally different than what we think about here in terms of that. So these are sociocultural influences on the way we purchase things. In the South, we eat a lot of chicken fried steak. We eat a lot of stuff that we probably shouldn't. In other parts of the country, they don't. Our friends and family obviously influence what we buy. They're a huge impact on what we buy. What you grew up with and what you're comfortable with has a huge impact on buying decisions and consumer purchases that you'll make throughout your life. Then psychological. Perception is reality. And I use an example from the political market space. The perception of Gerald Ford, for example, was that he was a klutz. There was one instance in which he was caught sort of stumbling off of a stage when he was president of the United States, and that was used against him. And the perception in the mind of the voter, and in the political market space, the voter is the consumer, was that he was clumsy. Nothing could be further from the truth. Gerald Ford was a college quarterback. There are lots of positions you can play in football that you may not have to be the most coordinated. It's just about brute strength. But quarterback is not one of those positions. That is not the, he was really good at this. He was also a great ballroom dancer. But the perception was that he was clumsy. Reagan. The perception of Reagan was that he was this kind, fatherly, grandfatherly figure. Nothing could be further from the truth. Reagan's own children hated him for the most part. He had these children from his first marriage, and to give you an example of how cold and sort of dissociative Reagan was, he had these children from his first marriage, and when he was running for president, they wanted to be part of their father's lives. And because they were so much older than the children from his second marriage, and age was a factor in Reagan running, they went to the campaign manager and they said, what can we do to help? And his response was, if you really want to help your father, you'll go out, dig a hole, bury yourself, and never be seen again. And when his kids went to Reagan and said, this is what they said, he said, well, when you hire people, you have to take their advice. Most of us, I don't have children, but if somebody, I imagine that if I had children, if somebody had said that to my child, I would have fired them. They would be gone. And his response, but he was completely devoted to Nancy, and there was just nothing outside that world. It was their whole marriage, like their children just did not really care for them. Now, after he dies, two of his kids, sort of have, Maureen and I think the other boy from the first marriage, have sort of gotten more, warm feelings about their father. But that's a sort of and that's a halo effect. Everybody when they die has a tendency His younger son, Ron Reagan Jr., is an atheist. His father was certainly not an atheist. I think you can see a huge divide there. The perception of Reagan's vice president, when they did public opinion polling and they asked who's taller, Reagan or George Herbert Walker Bush, everybody said Reagan. Because Reagan had this sort of commanding voice, and everybody thought Bush sounded like a New England, kind of old family stuffy, and he had this nasally voice, and it was dubbed the wimp factor. Nothing could have been further from the truth. George Herbert Walker Bush was taller than Reagan, far more informed than Ronald Reagan ever thought about being, and he had been director of the Central Intelligence Agency. You don't get to be director of the Central Intelligence Agency by being a wimp. It just doesn't happen, right? But the perception was that he was a wimp, and that, in the mind of the consumer, is everything. So these influences, how we come up with them, is important. A big one is psychographics now. It combines psychology, lifestyle, and demographics to divide consumers into eight segments. You can take this, it's called the VALS. You go to Strategic Business Insights, and you can take the VALS test and figure out where you are. And so basically what it does is it divides people into whether or not they have access to a lot of resources or no access to resources, and then their motivations. What motivates them to purchase certain things? So there are innovators, and then there are two categories that sort of don't. There are, if we go back to this other slide, there are survivors, and so these fall into motivation here, and survivors and innovators sort of fall outside of the other types because they can be motivated by a lot of things or not very much at all. So innovators seek lots of information. They're skeptical about advertising. If we're going to try and reach these people, it's going to have to be in other ways. They have a high education, usually. They don't believe that advertising is a valid source of information. They're enormously future-oriented, and they have a wide variety of interests and activities. And if we had time, I would ask you to do a critical thinking exercise where I'd say, what restaurant would innovators be interested in? Well, innovators are going to be interested in things that are new and exciting. So, for example, I'll just give you what I think might be an innovator's restaurant in Oklahoma City, Ludivine. They have a menu that is largely sourced locally. It's, it's this sort of slow food movement. That's something that's going to be attractive to innovators.
I think innovators, a lot of them are attorneys or things like that.
Thinkers have high access to resources. They're highly normative. So these tend to be, in terms of our current demographics, they tend to be traditionalists. So they're people that were highly educated. At one point in time, they may have been innovators in their own, sort of like my mother would have been sort of an innovator when she was younger. Now she's much more of a thinker. She's highly educated. They become highly normative. What that means is that they focus on the ought. They tend to plan and research things. They like historical perspectives. People who have had a lot of success have a tendency to look back and think, that the past is prologue. For example, they tend to be financially independent. This has been the largest thing in the United States in terms of finances. Historically speaking, if you went back in time, the wealth was produced by young people because they were the ones that could do the work. Now, as a result of, financial planning and things like that, these people, there's been a huge transfer of wealth from young to old. Historically, when you got old, you had to rely on your kids. If you had a farm, for example, you could no longer go out and plow the farm. Hopefully your kids would take over the farm and you would, sort of live off of them. That's no longer the case. We've had a huge transfer of wealth in this country from young to old. And, broadly speaking, they tend to be financially independent people. These are people who have in the past, for example, worked for companies that had pensions and they still have a pension. They're not influenced by fads. They use technology for functional purposes. So they will learn computers and things like that, but they use it for functional purposes, like to talk to the grandkids on FaceTime. if you have an iPhone. They like traditional intellectual pursuits like museums, art shows, and things like that, and they like proven products. And the example I give here is The Millionaire Next Door. There were some scholars that decided they were going to figure out how the average millionaire worked. They interviewed all of them. These people, at the time, the number one car among millionaires was the Ford Taurus. Why? Because it was like Ford's most popular model. It's like an ideal car in terms of it's roomy enough that you can get the family into it, but it's not flashy, it's not extravagant, it's not fast. It was just sort of a solid, reliable, all-American car. Low access to resources are believers. These are people who believe in basic rights, lead to a good life. Faith and spirituality are enormously important to them. They like friendly communities. They enjoy TV and romance novels for escape. They like stability. And these people, unlike thinkers, innovators, view advertising as legitimate. If it's on, an advertising, I'll give you an example of this. We have a woman who works for us in my family's business, and she was talking about all these conspiracy theories that she was hearing on the web. And my mother was like, my mother's like, where are you getting this? And she's like, well, it's on YouTube. If it's on YouTube, it must be real. And my mother's like, for God's sake, Amanda, Grant has a YouTube channel. And I was like, oh, of course, right. Like nothing I could say could possibly be, that's a really bad example like my mother came up with, but it was like, of course, nothing I put on YouTube, all of my YouTube channel for the most part tend to be educational videos. They are the live stream of my classes or me fixing, my truck mirror. That's the number one hit I've gotten on my YouTube channel is how to replace the truck mirrors on a Dodge Ram 3500 dually. So they view advertising as a legitimate source, and they're often very brand loyal. They tend to be very, very brand loyal. Believers tend to like things like, in terms of restaurants, if I was thinking, like if there's a small town cafe that they've always gone to, a greasy spoon, that's what they like. They also tend to be loyal to things like McDonald's because it's fast, cheap, and it's, consistent no matter where you go. Achievers have high access to resources. They have an attitude of me first. Achievers are first generation college graduates. They tend to be enormously goal oriented and hardworking. They have incredibly busy schedules. So they tend to value the status quo, like stability. They value technology insofar as it adds to productivity, but they don't value technology like innovators do for the thing in and of itself. They tend to be very peer conscious and usually professional. So the example I come up with for restaurants of what achievers like is at the top of the Devon Tower, there's a restaurant called Vast, right? Everybody knows it's sort of a high-end, restaurant. You're going to see a lot of sort of doctors and lawyers there, and they're going to like that because they're peer conscious. They're going to recognize that this is something that their peers will value. Strivers, on the other hand, have low access to resources. They switch jobs regularly in order to get advancement. They enjoy video games. These are usually people about your generation for the most part. They enjoy video games for fantasy. They tend to be fun-loving. The center of low-status street culture. What do we call these people today? Well, I guess they're labeled hipsters. They have interesting facial hair, and you can find them in places like the Plaza and the Paseo, right? They like things like Scratch, which is a sort of a local, craft cocktail bar and kitchen in the Paseo. They desire to better their lives, but they oftentimes have difficulty achieving this. This is one of the things that I have noticed when I talk to young people who ask me, because I am a college professor, is it worth it to go to college? A lot of them will say, I don't think it's worth it because of the debt, and I don't think it's going to better my life, and I can go out and I can make a living right now and not forsake those years of earning money. And so I'm not going to go to college. My answer to that is, in the past, when my mother went to college, and certainly when my grandmother graduated from college, my grandmother was born in 1919, so it was very unusual for anybody to have a college degree back then, let alone a female. But she did. a college degree for those people from my mother's generation and older, my mother's generation, or she's a baby boomer, that was a guarantee that you were going to reach middle class, right? It was going to guarantee that you're going to have a nice job and that you were going to at least achieve a middle class status. That's no longer the case. What I tell students is that it no longer is the case that a college education will assure that you achieve success, but if you don't have it, it's a heck of a lot harder to get it than without it. So it's not a guarantee the way it was in the past, but it certainly makes it a lot easier. And we know that people who go to college still have higher on average earnings. Now, what you cannot go to college and do is get a stupid degree. And I mean, I'm sure there's a need for musical theater people, but and that's probably not going to be a degree that's gonna help you get something. So what should you get your degree in? I'm going to give a shameless plug to our sales program, professional selling, right? Get a degree in professional selling. These people tend to wear their wealth. And the reason they do that is not to say that I'm rich, but it's rather to say I'm not poor. That's what some psychological experiments suggest. Experiencers have high access to resources. They want everything. They like the latest fashion. They go against the grain. They're enormously social. They like spontaneous activity. They'll just pick up and do things. They don't necessarily plan. They like a lot of physical activity. So they have a heightened sense of visual stimulation. What kinds of restaurants are going to be attractive to these people? Well, it's going to be things like Hatched on Broadway in the Automobile Alley area, where it's sort of new food, it's the latest thing, it's a different menu than what we have, just sort of in terms of traditional eggs, bacon, and biscuits and gravy. The reason they call it Hatch is they use Hatch green chili from New Mexico. They're going to be attracted to things like the Boathouse District, where there's rowing and ropes courses and things like that. Makers have low access to resource. They distrust government. They like outdoor activities like hunting and fishing. They believe in strong gender roles. They tend to be exceedingly anti-intellectual. They view higher education with a great deal of skepticism. They want to own land. They want to move out of the country where nobody's going to tell them what they can do. And they want to protect what is theirs. So they view like having a concealed carry and a guard dog on your property as being important. Where are these people gonna? What kind of restaurant would be attractive to them? It actually happens to be one of my favorite, but I hate to admit that. Something like Toby Keith's, right? Very traditional menu, very sort of country western theme and atmosphere, where you have very strong identification. The country western genre has very strong sort of cultural gender roles associated with it. Survivors, this is the lowest group. They have the least access to resources. They're enormously risk adverse. Now, I told you that a minute ago that there was a huge percentage of transfer of wealth from younger to older in this country, but there are many older people that did not partake in that transfer of wealth, right? I mean, we've become, in many instances, rather than having sort of what we might consider a normal distribution, or what's often called the bell curve. So if we look at the normal distribution, and lots of statistics is predicated on the normal distribution, you have these tails where you have extremes, and the vast majority of people fall somewhere in the middle. And the normal distribution is important in a lot of things, and we assume a normal distribution in many types of groups. And for a long time, because we had such a strong middle class, this was the normal distribution. We are now getting a skewed distribution, or maybe even a bimodal distribution, in which wealth is really concentrated and you're either a have or have not. And that's frightening to a lot of us to see this sort of distribution take place, where people either are in one group or the other, rather than having this sort of broad middle class. There are a lot of older people who, because they had traditional jobs and maybe they lost their jobs as a result of the exporting of jobs from this country, from GM, where we used to build trucks and things like that, to going overseas, that maybe they have had financial difficulties. They're very brand loyal. Of all the groups, they watch television the most. Probably most of you don't watch television. You watch like YouTube or, I don't know, TikTok videos or things like that. But these people watch traditional television shows. They're the ones that are most likely to watch, and I think there's only 2 daytime soap operas left, but they watch, things like daytime soap operas. They're the least likely to have computers or internet access, and they're the most likely to still have a landline and not necessarily have a phone. I know that's hard to believe for most of us who are so committed to this device, but there are people out there that are like that. All right, any questions about that? I know I'm going really fast. Fortunately,
What chapter was all this in?
that was chapter 4.
4, okay.
So we're going on to chapter 5. Fortunately, you can go back and watch the video if you want and increase my ratings, right, by watching the video. So the communication process. So what is the definition of communication? Well, one definition, there's sort of competing definitions out there, is the exchange of ideas. Oh, and I've got a typo. I've got a misspelled word. I'll have to correct that. The exchange of ideas. All right. 2, another definition is establishing a commonness or oneness of thought between sender and receiver. And again, if we go back to what I was talking about with the ethics lectures and these questions of philosophy of knowledge and conduct and governance, what is it we can know? How do we know that we have the same ideas when we talk? That's important. And the communication process allows us the model to figure out where sort of things are breaking down, right, in the process. And what it is we're getting across to our constituent or consumer or friend, whoever it is that we're trying to influence. So we begin the communication process with the source, which is usually a company that wants to make people aware of its products. They're going to encode a message. They're going to figure out a channel there. Then there's going to be on the receiver's end decoding, and then the receiver, and then hopefully you have some kind of feedback loop between the two. What I didn't do, but I'll give you a shortened version, I usually do, again, a critical thinking challenge in which I read a portion of a book called Snowball, which is the authorized biography of Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett is known as the Oracle of Omaha. He was at one time the wealthiest man on earth. He is the chairman of a company called Berkshire Hathaway. Class A share, let's look at just, for example, what a Class A share of Berkshire is worth today. So a Class A share of Berkshire Hathaway today is selling for $459,970 for one share of Berkshire Hathaway. So he's called the Oracle of Omaha. At one point in time, he is charged with taking over Salomon Brothers. The federal government, Salomon Brothers, is engaged in some real financial irregularities. And he's charged with his partner, who's the vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, a guy named Charlie Munger, who's a lawyer, with taking over Salomon Brothers. And so the head of Salomon is a guy by the name of John Gutfried. And they sort of try to pin all the blame on John Gutfried. I'm not sure that he really knew everything that was going on among his trading floor. But at some point in time, he is trying to negotiate getting his golden parachute, right? So his lawyer is riding around in a car with Charlie Munger, who is Buffett's right-hand guy, vice chairman, very wealthy individual. And he's trying to negotiate, and Munger is like, just giving out grunts or being non-committal or trying to move the conversation along. And it ends up in an arbitration process where the lawyer is now questioning Charlie Munger as to what he said. And Charlie Munger says, I don't recall that, or, you know, as you were sitting there saying, he's like, do you remember when we had this conversation? He's like, I remember the general contours, but I was sort of just sitting there being polite. I turned my head off. I just sort of stopped listening. Unless something could pierce my band of indifference and get through, I didn't really pay much attention to what you were saying. Well, do you remember us asking for indemnification? And Munger says, yes, that pierced my band of indifference. Basically, I'm paraphrasing. That pierced my band of indifference. Being a lawyer, issues of indemnification generally get through. That's a legal term, right? It's an idea that what you do is you indemnify officers and directors from lawsuits. And he's like, you know, you're not doing your client any favors by going into that here, because I don't think I agreed to that. And so the lawyer continues questioning him. And at one point in time, Munger, on the stand in front of these arbitrators, said, I'm sorry, what did you say? I'm sorry, I'm afraid I've done it again. I turned my head off. And so the lawyer repeats the question. He said, I'm going to have to ask you again. I just was not focusing. What was it you were asking? And the lawyer asked for a third time. So what part of the communication process is broken down here? What's leading to this? I've turned my head off in this model. What do you have to overcome? It's not, no. I'll give you a duck for trying, but
I'm sorry, what was the question?
what is, in this idea of Charlie Munger turning his head off
Mhm.
and not paying attention, what's on this model? What is causing that?
The receiver not being open.
But why? Noise, that's it. That's the answer. It's noise. The thoughts in our head
Oh.
is noise. That's what you have to pierce. It's the band of indifference that Charlie Munger's talking about, that this is not getting through, right? So it's overcoming the noise. And we have all of this. When I teach, one of the things I have to overcome, the noise, is you all are on your computers here, and in theory, you're taking notes. I know because I walk around the classroom and I see, you know, people have TikTok up or things like that. That's noise. That's the distraction to you getting the full effect of my message, right? So if I'm turning my head off, if I'm paying attention to other ads, if I'm getting up and going to the bathroom, those are all things that we have to get through. So identifying target markets. What kind of product are we talking about? Mass markets and audiences for products that everybody's going to use, things like toothpaste. Traditional media may be very effective with that, right? Are there market segments? Everybody's going to have to use toothpaste. Now we segment almost everything in the postmodern world. When I was a kid growing up, you know, milk was just milk. We now have segmented that. They have these things called almond milk. There is no such thing as almond milk. It may be almond juice, but this idea of like almonds don't lactate. It's not, you know, it's not milk, but we have all of these things that we call milk that are not really milk. But even among the milk products, again, when I was a kid, there was basically whole milk and skim milk. And there was this horrible stuff called powdered milk that you could buy, which was just god awful, that they developed, I think, for soldiers and MREs. But that was it. There was whole milk and skim milk. Now we've got whole milk, skim milk, 2% milk. We've got chocolate milk. We've got lactose-free milk, which they basically put in an enzyme that takes care of the lactose. One of the things that's interesting about that is that if you look at the shelf life of lactose-free milk compared to regular whole milk, it's a lot greater, because the lactose is what starts the process of the milk degrading and turning, you know, sort of to sour milk. So are there lots of market segments? Are there niche markets? Niche markets are, you know, highly specialized types of products. And then individual and group audiences. So what is it that we're targeting? Everybody has to buy toothpaste. That's going to be something that we can sell easily on television and things like that. Niche markets, you're going to have to do a lot more probably personal sales in those, in terms of developing your IMC plan. So the ADA model: awareness, interest, desire, and action. There was something called the 3 exposure hypothesis historically, which is you have to say things 3 times. It's one of the things that I do in this class. I try to, for things that are going to be on the exam, say things 3 times so that you get it, to create awareness and then an interest and then develop a desire and hopefully get some kind of action. How do we do that? Well, there's the standard learning hierarchy: learn, feel, do, that they talk about, right? We're going to learn, we're going to feel it, and then we're actually going to do it. Low involvement hierarchy suggests that the learn, feel, do may occur when the purchase decision is low. There is very little difference between brands. So in terms of toothpaste, there's not a lot of difference between brands, really, in reality. They've all got sort of the same thing. They've all, most of them have fluoride, things like that. There may be some differences in taste, but they all kind of have a tendency to be, I remember the toothpaste that we used as a kid, it was Close Up, it was the red one, that was it. I don't even think that they make Close Up anymore. Anyway, minimal difference between brands. Your mass media is important. Things like Coca-Cola. Almost everybody drinks Coke at some point in time, or some kind of carbonated, caramelized beverage, which is the definition of a cola. It may be Coke or Pepsi. There's not a lot of difference, right? They're both carbonated, caramelized, dark beverages. Although Pepsi is an inferior product, a tool of the devil.
Is this supposed to say may occur when?
May occur, yeah, not my. Again, got another typo in there. Got to proofread these before I put them out there. I'll try and do that. All right. So selecting the source, message, and channel. So this is the persuasion matrix. This is in your textbook. You can find it in the chapter. It's sort of towards the beginning of the chapter, and we'll go through each of these sort of steps and factors as we go through this. So the persuasion matrix, the receiver has to have comprehension. Is our message clear and understandable? Are we being clear? What's clear? Well, if we think about things like a contract, which lots of business transactions involve contracts, in the law, historically, with regard to classical contracts doctrine, one of the things that we looked at was what was called the 4 corners test. If you could look to the document and ascertain the meaning of the document and the intent of the parties from the document, you don't go to outside the document to explain it. So what is clear and unambiguous? Well, turns out, again, if we go back to those ideas of philosophy, this is harder than we think, because I think I may be being clear and unambiguous with regard to something.
So that's when persuasion.
And you may not understand what I'm saying, right?
It's like
You may not get it.
Perception of.
Right. So it's perception. What is it that is clear and unambiguous? Well, if I say again, is this a table or a desk? Well, I think we have some idea, but this is more difficult than you think it is. Which channel or media is going to increase the presentation's effectiveness?
Visuals.
Maybe, not necessarily. It depends on the audience, right?
Oh.
What kind of message will create favorable attitudes? For example, the use of humor can get people's attention, but it may not lead to recall. I'll give you an example of this. I'll show you this really quickly. Hopefully I don't run out of time. Here, go to YouTube. We'll open another YouTube. Hopefully it won't cut me off. So that was an award-winning ad the year that it came out, the Herding Cats commercial. It used humor. Nobody remembered what the company was.
Yeah, I didn't
So-
understand.
It gets your attention. It's funny, right? It grabs your, that's one of the things we want to do, awareness, interest, desire, action, but it doesn't necessarily lead to recall. So what is going to get the consumer's attention and break through the clutter? That ad breaks through the clutter, doesn't really lead to recall, right? So source factors. The person involved in communicating the message. Do they have credibility? For example, lots of companies use Hollywood stars. And the example I give here is political endorsements. Do we really care what Madonna thinks? Or you know, Jane Fonda, they used to call Jane Fonda, you all are too young to remember this, but during the Vietnam War, she went to Vietnam and she sort of suggested that our country was not behaving in a great way. And it turns out that we weren't, maybe. But she got really bad rap for it, and she was called Hanoi Jane after that. And she was sort of seen as a left-wing, harebrained extremist. And you know, do we care what Jane Fonda's opinion is? Not really, no. Now, if you use Tiger Woods to sell, I mean, one of the things that they've used him, for example, to sell Buick, for example, you know, what they wanted to do is they wanted to increase the image of Buick among that demographic, a younger demographic. What is the image of Buick at the time? Well, it was your grandma's car. It was not a car that you all would want to drive. Well, they wanted, so they like got Tiger Woods to endorse Buick. The problem is that, you know, like there's a disconnection between what he's good at, which is golf, and cars, right? They use it all the time, but do they have credibility?
Maybe like a race car driver would have been better.
Yeah. Yes, that would probably, you know, using the answers, for example, might have been a better source. So applying expertise. Salespeople should have credibility, for example, in personal selling, training, in order to be credible. Are they trustworthy? Are they people that we trust? So, you know, like Morgan Freeman and Oprah Winfrey have a lot of trust. They just, you know, I mean, Oprah has this book club. She's been around for a long time. She did this talk show. She has built up a reservoir of trust with a lot of people who watch that and enjoy her programming. Her production company is called Harpo, which is Oprah spelled backwards. And, you know, she's, you know, in the past been a pretty good spokesman for a lot of things. She has elevated a lot of people through her show, even ones that are sort of crazy. This is not a political statement, but you know, one of the people that she sort of allowed to rise to prominence was this guy named Dr. Oz. He's got some crazy ideas from a medical standpoint, but he ran for Senate, you know, using Donald Trump as his basis, you know, and I think that probably hurt his credibility. But like some of his theories are, you know, not well accepted in the medical community. But you know, because Oprah endorsed him, he got ahead. Dr. Phil is another one. You know, I mean, I don't know. The guy has some real interesting, peculiar ideas, but because Oprah endorsed him, he really, you know, got ahead. I mean, he had one of the most popular shows on television, full of insanity. And I'm not sure about the soundness of his advice all the time. Using the corporate CEO in your advertising, and the one I use here is Papa John's. Turns out Papa John's makes like some real crazy statements. He's no longer the spokesman for Papa John's, and he's no longer the CEO, by the way, right? He's just not credible. The limitation of credible sources. Just because a source is credible in one area doesn't mean that they're credible in all, right? So again, Tiger Woods, if he's going to sell golf clubs, highly credible. Selling a Buick, maybe not so much. Attractiveness. People tend to be influenced by people who are similar to them or they perceive as being similar to them. Donald Trump made connections with people that are nothing like him. But because they viewed him as a straight talker, again, this is not a political message, this is a reality. You know, he's not like a lot of his supporters. The vast majority of people who vote for president are not that wealthy. He's not as wealthy as he says he is, but he's pretty wealthy. But, you know, they perceive him as being like him because they feel like they're the ones that, you know, talk real and you know, don't hide behind smoke screens and things like that. The likability of your source. Dennis Quaid is viewed as being, for example, and very likable, and they've used him in a lot of ads recently. If you have too much exposure, it can be a problem. If somebody endorses too many products, that can lead to a problem in terms of the overexposure. There's also a risk to advertisers in using people like Tiger Woods. When his marriage imploded, a lot of people were turned off by him. A lot of people, you know, didn't want to be associated with him. He lost a lot of his advertising panache. What's the return on investment? So this is the source factor sort of model. The celebrity and product, the product and consumer, of movement forward. So choosing a celebrity endorser, because this happens a lot. How do we do this? Well, one of the ways that they can evaluate this is using Q scores. They have respondents look at and say, have you seen or heard of the celebrity? Now, this is getting harder to do. When I was a kid growing up, we sort of knew who the stars were. And I could probably mention some stars' names, and everybody in here would probably have heard of them, but it's harder to do because so many people are now, you know, are they really a celebrity, or I don't know, are they an influencer on YouTube? All of these outlets have allowed for people to gain popularity. Lots of people are creating their own huge things. So on YouTube, their own influencing channel. I watch a couple of British guys. One is named Josh and the other one's named Ollie. And so you put it together and they get jolly, and it's about them going around and eating food and some other things, but it's kind of funny. The first video I ever saw of them was two British guys eating Southern biscuits and gravy, and it was hysterically, I mean, they're just kind of goofballs and oddballs. Are they really famous? Does anybody really know who they are? They've got millions of followers on YouTube. They're making a living at this. What about Charlie Puth? He's another one that started out on YouTube. He's crossed over into, but I don't think he's got the celebrity status of, say, I don't know, Pink.
Since he did a song with Jungkook from BTS, he definitely has skyrocketed even more.
You know, I mean, is he as famous as, I don't know, Beyonce?
Probably not.
No, I don't think so. They next rate the scale on good, fair, poor, and then the Q scores are broken down on the basis of demographics to rate popularity among different groups to see if you're going to hit your target audience. The likability, decorative models. Some models are going to draw attention to your ads, but not to the product. And attention has to go beyond the model to the product to ensure that you're delivering a selling message. Source power. Does the source have power? Well, power is, in its rawest form, the ability to administer rewards or punishments. Now, these don't have to be tangible or even felt. They can be perceived or intangibles. If you have power, it can elicit a response to the source. So the perception of being able to administer positive or negative sanctions is important in terms of the source power. Is the source, for example, think about Tiger Woods and golf clubs. it's probably not using a stick. If you don't use Tiger Woods golf clubs, it's not going to necessarily be a bad thing. People are gonna, look at you funny. But is there some panache? That's a perception. That's a power position. Why does he have power? Because he should have knowledge in this area. And so you view that knowledge as being an ability to give you an idea of what the product's good is and achieve your goal, which is, for most golfers, to improve their golf game. The ability of the source to observe conformity. Well, in advertising, you generally don't have this. Tiger Woods doesn't have the ability to go out and tell whether or not people are conforming, but we can get indirect measures. So if they release new golf clubs, they get Tiger to sponsor it, and it takes off, we've got an indirect measure. The receiver adapts to the persuasive influence. Do they accept the influence of persuasion that's being presented to them? The messaging factors, the structure. How should you present your appeals? This is important. The order of presentation, there's two kind of diametrically opposed, again, a thesis and an antithesis. The primacy effect, the first thing that you hear is what you have a tendency to remember. A lot of times when we do taste testing, so we did this in several classes of mine when I was partnering with another professor who was in hospitality, and we had sort of this consulting firm on the side. So one of the things that we did was we tested, for example, flavors of and the quality of frozen yogurt among students. One of the things we know with things like with tasting is because you're not primed, the first taste is usually the one that you like. So you have to switch the order of the yogurts that we give you in terms of being able to assess the quality and have a really good, valid idea as to that. Because in that instance, the primacy effect, the first one you taste is generally the one that you like the most. After that, your taste buds become acclimated to that kind of thing, and it can lead to problems. It's why one of the things if you go into it, nobody does this anymore for the most part, but when I was growing up, you could smoke when I went to college, you could smoke in the buildings here at UCL. And then it got to the point where you could only smoke in one building, and that was the student union. And then it got to the point where you could only smoke in one area, and that was downstairs. And then we finally went smoke free, but you could still smoke outside. And now we have a totally smoke free campus. But one of the things that people did at that point in time, and I've noticed this, is nobody wears lots of cologne anymore or perfume. And one of the reasons that we don't is because not everybody's smoking. So you don't have to cover up or mask the odor. If you went into a perfume store, in order to avoid your primacy effect, what they do is they'd have you smell after you smelled a sample of perfume on a card, which is a bad way to do it. But it's hard, you end up smelling really bad if you try it on yourself because you've got all these different competes. But between each one, they would have you smell coffee beans, because then it switches the sort of aroma that you're getting, and it recalibrates your nose to try something else. The recency effect says people remember the last thing they heard. Oftentimes, this is what you want to do in political messaging. You want to give them the last thing, the last thing that they're going to remember is your most powerful argument. Do you allow the receiver to draw the conclusions on their own, or do you give it to them? Are you explicit? A lot of this has to do with what kind of education level you have and what kind of product you're selling. If you're selling to survivors, if we think about the Val's type, you may have to be more explicit. Are there alternative sides? Again, in political marketing, for example, there are two sides usually to every issue, right? Do you present both sides and then refute your opponent using a counterclaim?
I feel like that would be the best way to do it. Or at least if you're selling something, you could lead, making them think it's their idea to go in that direction.
I think, there's been a lot written on political advertising, whether or not you should do a compare and contrast. One theory there is, and I'm not saying this is the right theory, is that if you acknowledge your opponent's position, you are giving them power. You're acknowledging that they have credibility. Whereas if you just don't acknowledge them, it's one of the reasons why if you're really popular and you're likely to win an election, you don't want to debate. You just don't want to debate, or you want to limit debates, because the only thing you're going to do is if you're really, but now in a presidential election, you're going to have to debate, right? There's going to be debates. You're going to have to do it, but you want to set the ground rules for those debates. One of the things that will happen in the Republican primaries with Donald Trump announcing that he's running is that he's going to bring people, whether you like him or not, you know it's going to be a show. So you're going to watch the debate. He really doesn't want to debate, because what he's doing by standing on the stage with those other people is saying that they're worthy opponents. And he may not view them as worthy opponents, right? Are you going to use verbal or visuals to support your argument?
I think you should do both. 'Cause
I think it
there's-
depends.
There's gonna be people that are drawn to visuals, and there's gonna be people that are better with verbal.
I think it depends on the product a lot of times, right? Whether or not you use more visual, and it also depends on the medium source that you select. If you're using television, it's largely visual, right? I mean, it's largely a visual. It's always interesting to me how many people say, I was listening to television, as I was getting ready. Television is not a medium that you're supposed to listen to. You're supposed to watch, but we do. We all just turn it on and have it sort of running in the background. So message appeals, comparative advertising. For example, looking at cell phone coverage. They used to do this, Verizon did this as a consumer, like this is ours, this is the other. Now they've got a spoof on that with Ted Danson, where they go into a cellular, dealer, and he's like, this is our premium coverage, and this is the other guy. And it's like, they're both the same, except the color is different. And he's like, but this is premium, right? So comparative advertising. Comparative advertising works a lot, particularly you see this on labels, where you see, for example, the store label, not technically a generic label, comparing our ingredients to the active ingredients in X, right? The use of fear. Fear can have a good or a positive, not good necessarily, but in terms of a moral judgment, but a good impact on the public. If you're able to use that and then provide hope. So if you use fear, you have to provide hope. So low fear ads may attract interest and may motivate. If you have too much fear, it may completely paralyze the individual and cause them to block out what you're saying. Humor can be used to attract. Again, thinking about the ad that I just showed you, the herding cats, it's humorous. We all watched it. Why? Because there's just such a juxtaposition between this iconic image. The American cowboy is, in the American West, is one of the iconic images of America. Now, the reality of that is that era existed for an enormously brief period of time in our nation's history. But it still has enormous impact on our perceptions, particularly in places like Oklahoma and the West, where we were influenced by this idea. But it's a huge icon of American political and socio-culture references to the American West.
How a lot of other countries see us.
It is. That is, I mean, they view us as the cowboys, right? So using that and then juxtaposing it with, here's these cowboys that are supposed to be herding cattle, and now they're herding little cats, and they're trying to be really gentle with little cats, and it's really funny, but it can get in the way. It can distract, and you may not, again, remember. Nobody remembered after they showed that ad that it was EDS that did it.
Yeah, they didn't really put anything about themselves until like the
very
very
end.
Yeah, they didn't
And
even
so
explain.
nobody remembered it.
Yeah.
So channel factors, are you going to use personal versus non-personal? Personal is often more persuasive. Personal selling is more persuasive. It's harder to tell people no in person. It's also a lot more expensive. Personal selling is really costly. The effects of mass media. For example, if you use print or online, that's self-paced. I can look at it and read it at my leisure. Whereas if you use TV and radio or some other dynamic thing, it limits the length and the complexity that you can have. in that. So qualitative effects are important. The context and environment and how that affects the quality. Clutter. How much advertising do you have to get through in the medium that you're selecting? How do you get through that and break through that? Again, if you can get personal selling, you can oftentimes break through the clutter because you can sit there and monitor. You have an instant feedback loop with the person that you're selling, and you can tell if they're drifting off, but it's expensive. All right, so I made it through, yay, with 5 minutes to spare. Any questions about, we covered an enormous amount of territory today. So since we got through, that's where I will, that's the material I will stop the exam on. So it will be through chapter 6 for this first exam. And I will have that up shortly. You will have until midnight, a week from today, to complete that.
Is it multiple choice or essay?
It will be both multiple choice and there will be an essay, which I should talk about the essay. An essay is not one paragraph in here. It's like multiple paragraphs,
I learned that the hard way.
right? Like 5 is generally, and like a paragraph is not one sentence. It's multiple, so it should have like, the way it should be structured is you should have a thesis, which is like, I'm gonna argue that this is the correct course. You will have to make a decision in this. And I can tell you the first one will be an ethics and advertising essay. So you'll have a thesis, and then you're going to, which is, you know, like, this is ethical or this is not ethical in an advertising context. Then you need to provide substantive points to support those 3. So, you know, for example, if you're asking why the ad is unethical, this ad is unethical, you know, your thesis statement is, this ad is unethical for 3 reasons. It relies on fear, it, you know, is an example of manipulation, and thus, you know, human beings' will is overborne, something like that, right? So 3, and then another substantive point, and then you have a conclusion that flows from these. So there's a nexus here, a connection between this that logically leads to a conclusion, right? That's the way it works. Any other questions about that? So it will be 25 questions, which will be 50 points, and then an essay, which will be 50 points. So the multiple choice will be worth 2 points apiece, yeah.
Is the essay also gonna be like a part of multiple choice, or is it gonna be like 2 different parts?
It's 2 different parts. So, and it'll be on D2L. Yes.
Will the essay portion be like timed, or will I have
No.
time to?
You have as much time as you need.
Okay.
Well, that'd be awful if it was time.
Yeah, no, I don't time it. So, which is also why I don't use ProctorU, because if you're gonna, you may have to cite sources,
Do you have
so.
specific content to study for the multiple choice?
I generally pick questions from what I've gone over in my lecture, mostly. If I covered it in class, I cover stuff that's in the text, but if I didn't cover it, specific stuff in the test, I don't ask. For example, at the beginning of every chapter, lots of multiple choice tests will include questions about the little vignettes that they talk about, the little, you know, the case studies at the beginning of chapters. I don't ever cover those, for example. You don't have to know, you know, I mean, like, I think in the current one, they talk about Tesla in some of the chapters or something like, I don't cover that. So it will be like broad. It'll ask you for like a lot of times the best possible, what is the, you know, is the best choice. So you have to, like, I always give this example. Which of the following statements about marketing is most correct? Okay. Marketing is a persuasive academic discipline. Marketing is a social activity. Everyone markets. Well, and then the 4th one, everyone engages in marketing. It's a persuasive social activity, right? That's the most correct. So a lot of people will just pick the first one because those are all 3 correct, and not, you know, get to the most correct, which is like, it involves all of those. Right? And a lot of the questions we'll ask, I will give like little examples and then ask you, you know, like, what does this example entail? Is this an example of encoding? Is this an example of noise? Is this an example of, for example, in the communication model? What's going on? Given the communication model, what's going on here? So, good questions. Other questions? No? All right, I'm out of time. I'll see you guys in a week, and I'll get that exam up just as quickly as I can. And again, you have a week to do it.